Michael Schwam-Baird is a 2002 graduate of Cornell University, where he earned a BA in Literature, Theory, and Writing. In 2004, he received a Marshall Scholarship to pursue a master's degree in Economic and Social History at Oxford University. Currently, he is Assistant Director for Research at the Cowen Institute for Public Education Initiatives at Tulane University. In this role, he is charged with informing the process of public education improvement in New Orleans. He has also served as the lead author on a number of reports concerning public education in New Orleans, including the state of public education in New Orleans, the latest edition of which will be briefed on Thursday, March 18th at 5 p.m. I wanted to make that announcement for you to mark your calendars. And it will take place at the Tulane's Waldenberg Art Center, Freeman Auditorium. The title of Mr. Schwam-Baird's presentation is Interpretations of New Orleans Public Education Before and After Katrina, Race, Ideology, and Incomplete Information. And just a side note, we will have a brief Q&A. So after Mr. Schwam-Baird's presentation, we will have a brief Q&A and then break for lunch. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Michael Schwam-Baird.
Well, thank you very much. I'll try to be brief, and my presentation, I think, fits nicely with Dr. Smith's and Dr. Miron's. Oh, awesome. Thank you. Where's that one? All right, I think we got that figured out. So again, thank you very much, and I'll try to keep this brief. So I wanted to talk about interpretations of public education in New Orleans, and I think today you've already seen some interesting interpretations of the state of public education now and as it was before Katrina. I think that the story of black education in New Orleans before and during desegregation in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s is an important and also a relatively established narrative of the struggle to overturn the segregation in the schools and the sort of culmination of the process of Brown versus Board of Education, the civil rights movement, court orders to desegregate, resistance and violence to desegregation, and then eventual court-ordered and foot-dragging desegregation. Now, I talk about this because this is a period that is very important in the history of public education in New Orleans, and it's also one that is pretty well documented and about which there's been a lot written, and it's very interesting, and I encourage you to go and look at it. And I say that because I think it's in contrast to the period that follows that, the period from about the mid-1970s to the hurricane, about which I think we actually don't have a lot of good narratives to talk about. It's not because there's a lack of information or potential information that we could get from speaking to people, interviewing people, talking to people like Dr. Smith and Dr. Miron, who was here at the time. But we have a variety of ways of talking about it which aren't often rooted in what I think we know about the period or could know about the period. So I just want to talk a little bit about the older period, and I'll actually do this faster than I intended to get through it. This is public school enrollment in New Orleans, black and white students in total from 1880 to the present. I think the main thing to see is that in the period of segregation, especially in the early 1900s, late 1800s, most African Americans were restricted to lower grades. There were not high schools for African Americans, and the system was majority white until about the 50s, at which time that switched. And then there was pretty quick white flight and white disinvestment from schools up through the present. The black population increased and then stabilized, and then actually was falling quite dramatically before the storm, from about, I think, around 80,000 to about 60-ish thousand before the storm. When you look at the old figures this is actually in some state reports that are in the Tulane Public Library, and they're quite interesting. The difference in investment is quite explicit between black schools and white schools in terms of state expenditures. And these are actual, tabulations that they instruct budget officers to do, where you budget for a school and you budget this much for a white teacher and this much for a black teacher. So it's extremely explicit language about the nature of segregation and investment in schools. I think that, let me not get to this. So we have this period, and it's pretty well established, the history of this period. at least in my mind and in what I've read. And so in contrast to this, what surprises me is the lack of scholarly work about the period from roughly the end of the desegregation period, so mid-1970s or so, to Hurricane Katrina in 2005. And I think since Katrina especially, this period has been repeatedly referred to using a variety of narratives, but with little to back that up, besides news reports and appeals to collective wisdom about that period, this 1970 to 2005 period. And I think that this is a major problem, because it allows many authors in the post-Katrina period to characterize the pre-Katrina and post-Katrina educational landscape according to their particular ideological lens without much evidence, in my opinion. So I think the most interesting example of this, I don't know if you're familiar with Naomi Klein, but she wrote a book called The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, right? This is a book, it's an interesting book. It dissects the role that Chicago-style economics has played in creating disaster capitalism, or, quote, the rapid-fire corporate re-engineering of societies that are reeling from shock. And she talks a lot about post-communist Russia, about the use of contractors in Iraq. She's got sort of a wide-ranging analysis of this. And she does talk a little bit about post-recovery New Orleans, mostly about FEMA's heavy use of contractors in post-Katrina New Orleans. But in addition to this, she applies the same reasoning that she does to all these different analyses to charter schools in New Orleans. And what she says is that chartering schools in New Orleans post-Katrina is just more corporate privatization, analogous to hiring Halliburton to rebuild Iraq or Blackwater to police it. And this is the quote from Klein. She gives about 1 page to schooling in her whole book, but this is what she says. She says, in sharp contrast to the glacial pace with which the levees were repaired and the electricity grid was brought back online, the auctioning off of New Orleans' school system took place with military speed and precision. Within 19 months, with most of the city's poor residents still in exile, New Orleans' public education system had been almost completely replaced by privately run charter schools. Before Hurricane Katrina, the school board had run 123 public schools. Now it ran just 4. Before the storm, there had been 7 charters in the city. Now there were 31 at the time of this writing. New Orleans teachers used to be represented by a strong union. Now the union's contract had been shredded, and its 4,700 members had all been fired. Some of the younger teachers were rehired by the charters at reduced salaries. Most were not. So Klein's account is kind of, I think, somewhat typical of a lot of these post-storm writing. It's provocative and it has some true statements, but it lasts for a page, and then she proceeds to talk about Milton Friedman and Chile and Iraq and everything else. It also completely ignores the fact that the school system was essentially financially bankrupt before the system and had no money to keep paying teachers if it wanted to. It ignores the entire history of the school board's management of public schools in the years before the storm, which might make any outsider, conservative or liberal, think twice about reconstituting what existed before. But it fits into Klein's ideological paradigm, and so she throws it in. And I feel like a lot of the writing on New Orleans post-Katrina has been a lot of that. Well, let's throw it in. We have the lens already. Let's just apply it. So let's think about this void in what I think is at least our collective understanding of this period. I think work like Klein's is possible because there is little good writing on the period before Katrina that gets at how things got to the way they were in the summer of 2005 before the flood, especially at any level below the school board level or the higher levels in the school central office. And into this void, authors have made a lot of claims about the pre-Katrina system that in turn inform their understanding of the post-Katrina system and the reforms that were made. And there's often a good deal of truth to these analyses, even though they tend to be partial and one-sided. And I think the narrative tends to run in 2 ways. This is kind of how I see it. One narrative focuses on the mismanagement and corruption of the school board and the NOPS central office. As was mentioned before, the FBI indicted 20-plus central office employees. NOPS had terrible financial controls, was paying a lot of people who no longer work there. There was an OPSB member who went to jail for accepting bribes. There's abundant evidence for this narrative, and it's difficult to argue with. And it's an argument that's frequently used to make the case for the post-storm takeover of schools by the state. And it's an argument that kind of swipes at the legitimacy of the educational leadership in New Orleans before the storm. And it's made quite often. The other narrative focuses on the racially motivated disinvestment of whites in New Orleans and of the state government more broadly from the public education of the predominantly black population of New Orleans public schools in the 20 years or so before Katrina. This narrative sets things up for the post-Katrina period to describe it as the culmination of a plan to destroy public education. The teachers were fired, thus undermining unionism and the black middle class in New Orleans. And like Naomi Klein, charter schools in this system are seen as, connected to certain outside ideologies like neoliberalism or the worst abuses of capitalism, or in some cases compared to resegregation. I think the Orfield's study kind of falls into that, though it's an empirical study. I'm not saying it's wrong, but I think that's the argument that's good, the direction that argument is going in. So these narratives, these two narratives, the first one and the second one, these are political narratives, but they're also racial narratives in the sense that the first is a narrative of many, though certainly not all whites from New Orleans, and the second is the narrative of many, though certainly not all blacks from New Orleans. The second one is also favored by a lot of academics and activists who write about public education in New Orleans, and I take this not from tons of conversations, but for some, but also from reading a lot about what's been written about New Orleans. And I see it fall into these narratives pretty exclusively. So each of these narratives has certain points of important blindness to history, which is why I think it's essential that we have a better examination of this post-desegregation period from the 1970s to 2005. The first narrative, of course, says nothing about the years of segregation and unequal schooling before and after desegregation, and says little about white resistance to taxation and redistributionary policies post-desegregation or even pre-desegregation. It also says little about the endemic corruption that existed in the public education system when it was segregated and when whites were in charge of the system. It also has little to say about the system at all, except for that last decade or so before Katrina, when we have this nice story about corruption. And it also does not recognize the community's anxiety about the entire reworking of public education before the storm. The second narrative says little about the poor leadership of public schools in the 2 decades before Katrina. So there have been lots of critiques, and they're valid critiques, of the RSD for continuing to run failing schools, but few of those criticisms ask, what about those failing schools for 10 or 20 years before the storm, and who is in charge of them then, and who is accountable for that? Paul Vallis is accountable now. Who is accountable then? This narrative takes little responsibility for the black leadership that also failed black students once it was in power. And it ascribes few good intentions to the people who brought about changes to the public school system in New Orleans following Katrina. And finally, it connects the project of school reform in New Orleans post-Katrina to a variety of ideological projects, which I think is a bit far-fetched, including neoliberalism, free market capitalism, profiteering, resegregation, and these ideological projects are claimed to harm poor people and minorities. So I think that in reality, we know that most of the events cited by these two narratives are true. I mean, they all took place. But there's been little accountability for the poor education that many black children have received in New Orleans for this period that we talk about. And what I think we need is a better understanding of this period, and we need to get to know how things got to this point in 2005 before Katrina, though a lot of our time is being spent talking about post-Katrina. So there's a few things to look at in the period post-Katrina. They're not perfect. We have information about school performance, and this is the district performance score for Orleans Parish. It's true that the state did change the law to allow more schools to be taken over, but the vast majority of schools were already considered failing and under 60 that were taken over, and then additional ones were, and that's not necessarily fair, but the state could have certainly taken over the vast majority of the schools it did take over. Orleans Parish was near the bottom of Louisiana in terms of performance, which was already near the bottom of all the states in performance. And I'd just like to show this in a country that's not exactly outperforming its peers in terms of student performance. As Dr. Miron mentioned, a lot of the reforms that happened had some precedent. There was already a recovery school district before Katrina. It had been set up in 2003. There were charter schools in the city. And what happened post-storm was an expansion of these, and it was radical in a sense, and it did change a lot. But it also had precedents in law. It didn't spring out of nowhere. This was the pre-Katrina system where the OPSB is running most schools, has a few charter schools, and then there's the RSD. And then this is now, with all these different types of schools. In terms of what the schools look like. Before the storm, the schools were 90% African American. They're still about 90% or more African American. The charter schools, in most cases in the RSD, are the same as the other open access schools. It's slightly lower in the OPSB charter schools, which are more selective schools in some cases. But this is still the system. And in terms of the role of resegregation, I'd like to see more about the Orfield study, because it seems like in a system of 90% African American students, it is already a segregated system. I don't know what would be more segregated about it. In terms of free and reduced lunch, RSD charter schools actually have higher populations of poor students than even RSD run schools, so that could be a glitch, but it's probably about the same. And all the schools in New Orleans have much higher poverty rates than the national average of 41%, and are mostly well above the Louisiana average as well. The one area where I think there are some disparities that should be looked at is in the area of special education, and this has been alluded to. There are higher rates in both direct run school systems of special education students, and I think there's a variety of things to get at there. I don't have all the answers to why these numbers are there, but I think that is quite important to look at. And then a lot has been said about the selective admission schools, which, as Dr. Miron pointed out, are pretty much the holdover of the magnet schools from before the storm. There are some selective admission schools, overtly selective schools. There's not a whole lot of them. They're the ones that are here in red. And they have varying levels of selectivity, and then the rest are essentially open admissions. Though, as Dr. Smith pointed out, and as I think is true, there are ways in which selectivity happens, even when it's not overt. The other thing that I think is interesting is that parents show a fair amount of support for most of the post-Katrina reforms. And these are parents that were selected. They are registered voters, so that does skew the population a little bit. But in terms of SES and race and so on, they're pretty representative of the population. And when they were randomly selected and called, they supported reforms like the state takeover schools, the expansion of charter schools, school choice, new teachers, many of these major reforms. Now, what is interesting is that when asked whether schools are better since Katrina, a plurality, but not a majority of parents say that they are. So I think my takeaway from this is that there's a support among parents for the direction of reform, but certainly not for where things are now. There's a strong sense, as I think the data shows, that schools are still not where they should be, even if they are somewhat better. And I think that that's borne out in terms of the percentage of schools that are considered failing and not failing. Before the storm in 2005, over 60% of schools that we were talking about before were under 60 and considered failing by the state. That number is 42% now. That's an improvement, but when you think that statewide the average is 5%, it's still pretty horrendous. And I think that's what parents are reflecting when they say schools are not where they should be. That said, there has been improvement across all the levels of performance. So I think there's a lot to be mined in the period before Katrina, and obviously in the post-Katrina period. I think that a lot of authors have used a variety of ideological lenses to interpret the periods without a lot of good information. And I'm trying to keep this brief. There's a lot of different articles that are interesting to read in this process, though often frustrating to read. But I think that a lot could be gained from going back into the period, talking to people who were teachers in the old system, and talking about what was good in the old system and also what was bad in the old system, and taking some responsibility for that, even as we think about what the system needs to look like going forward. So that's my presentation.